personally, I would like to stay with you forever. So we come to our last discourse, which was on if the Pope is a revolutionary. So we started out first with our first lecture when it was so stormy outside and icy cold. We asked ourselves who the Pope is. That was our theme here. And now I have to find the last one here. So we started out with a model. We said that we can approach the Pope only in a certain context, and we talked about the antagonism between the sacred and the profane, and the religious and the secular, and we saw examples of that. So when it came up, we discussed that the last time, where the Pope made a statement from the religious side, then we had the secular side and said religion should not interfere with politics or with international things and so on. So that is exactly that split, and it comes up continually in our wars, our culture wars. If it is about divorce or birth control or whatever, on one side we have this religious position, and on the other side we have a secular position. And we said that we want to respect both of them, that we want to follow the argumentation on the religious side. Why does the Pope take this position, and what is it, how it is grounded? He cannot simply say something arbitrarily. If it is based in revelation, based in tradition, based in the canon law, and so on. But then we also want to look at the other side, the secular people, who also have an argumentation which has to be taken very seriously. So when they oppose stem cell research or so, then we have to listen to their argumentation as well. And we will always try to reconcile the two positions, and if we cannot reconcile them, then at least we want to be civil, and we don't want to cut each other's head off, but we want to say, for the time being, we have to agree to disagree. So that was our model, which we had as a basis. And then we asked if the Pope is a restoration man. Now that leads us into the issue that all words which we use have a historical context. They have a time core, they are historical, so we cannot simply say in general restoration, but it is very specific. The Council, the Second Vatican Council, brought great turmoil into the Roman Catholic paradigm. People were not prepared for it. It was done by wonderful theologians like Guardini and Rauner and so on. They promoted it, but down in the local level, which is very important, is all important maybe, people were not prepared. It was a shock for them. So suddenly the altar was moved away from the wall. The priest suddenly faced the people. Instead of having a sacrifice, he emphasized the meal character of the Eucharist. And so all this was not understood, and people were used to it, and it was the habit to see things, and suddenly everything changed. Not to speak of that after the Trent Council, about 400 years, the Church had closed up the windows against the Reformation, against secularity, against the Enlightenment, and suddenly they opened up the windows, and a terrible wind went through, and thousands of priests left the priesthood, thousands of nuns left the monasteries. So that was a horrible shock. And in terms of this shock then, very decent people like Paul VI became frightened. So they became frightened, what will happen to the Church? Everything falls apart, secularism wins, and so on. And so they closed the windows. That is what we call restoration. And the people who were on the side of the council, they came even to such extreme notions like that it was betrayed. So that from Paul VI to John Paul II and to Benedict XVI, that this was one betrayal after the other of the progress which the Church had made in this great council. So these are restoration people. They want to restore a condition which had been there before Vatican II. They wanted to restore Vatican I, and they wanted to restore maybe even the Trent Council, which was in 1546. It was shortly after the death of Luther, where the Catholic Church wanted to discuss the whole issue, but it was already tumultuous at that time. German bishops came. They were full of anger against the Pope, who had called the council. They had already introduced the lay chalice, which you have now in the church, that lay people can take the chalice. That had for 1,000 years, that was forbidden without any reason whatsoever. They had also canceled the celibacy for the priests for about 3 years. And then came the Jesuits. Remember, this Pope is a Jesuit. These are the counter-Reformation people. And they tried to keep things as they were, to make some reforms, but they forbid the lay chalice again. They restored the celibacy again. They killed many of the concubines which the priests had in their parishes. So it was a very violent type of a thing. And out of this violence came the wars then in the 16th century, and then came this 30-year war from 1618 to 48, in which all of Europe was devastated. Of northern Protestants and southern Catholics were butchering each other year after year, day after day. So when we talk about ISIS, we had it all. We can somehow help them over there with our own experience. So this is what we meant with restoration. And I think the solution is that the present Pope is not a man of restoration. Or at least that is what people who believe in the Council hope, that he is not a man of restoration. But we have to see that there is real evidence for it. So the restoration people threw out over 90 great theologians out of the Catholic Church because they didn't like their teachings. They were heretical and so on, and many of them lost their livelihood. Some of them went to the Anglicans or the Episcopalians and to other churches and so on. And so this painful thing, can that be made good again? We saw that one sign that the Pope really wants to do that is the beatification of Archbishop Romero, and also hopefully some of his priests. We have a movie about that, so you have a choice tonight if you want to see that, because to compare Romero and the present Pope, that can throw light on who the present Pope is. And so this beatification shows us very clearly he does not want to be a man of the Restoration. He wants to be something else. So his attitude toward liberation theology, we will have to see what that will be like. The civil war seems to have started again in El Salvador with the Arena Party, a fascist party, and so we have to see what his attitude is. But for the time being, we can say that he is not, and he does not want to be a man of restoration. That means to be faithful to the councils, to the council, the Second Vatican Council. It may not go so far that he wants to have a Jerusalem too. There was one, the first council was in Jerusalem. So some people hope for a Jerusalem too, that there are too many problems. I told you that friends of mine, we submitted to Benedict XVI's a document with maybe 100 different grievances which have to be settled. And some people think that this cannot simply be done by the Pope or the cardinals, so that a new council is needed and so on. So there is no talk about this, but definitely what we hope when we say he is not a man of the Restoration is that he will be faithful to the council and execute the council's decrees. Now, that is somewhat unusual because the councils have never been followed. That is a bad thing to say. But the Trent Council, it took centuries until the decrees of the Trent Council were slowly executed. And so there is some slowness in all of this, but at least that we hope that the Pope will not continue the counter thing out of fear that the Church will fall apart, and that he will really make a great effort to do what the Council promised, and then also prepare the way to go beyond the council, because it certainly didn't solve all the problems. You can see, for instance, the problem of the Reformation, the Great Reformation. Luther was saint material. If the great issue was the justification, how am I justified? Am I justified by my own works, or am I justified by God's grace and by God's pardon, and so on? And the Trent Council solved this. Karl Barth, the great theologian Hans Küng on the Catholic side, they affirmed it again. That means by 1546, the fundamental problem between Catholics and Protestants, the theological problem, justification, was solved. Now, why do they remain in this hostile situation? Why is one excommunicated by the other? Or why does one side say they are Romanism people, they are not Christian, and so on and so on? So there's no need really on the theological level, but then there's the politics which is involved, and there is the economics involved. The princes had in the meantime liquidated all the church property and had taken it over, and it could not be done. Even by 1530s and the 30s, there were humanists, followers of Erasmus, who, Protestants and Catholics, they talked with each other, and they had solved it all, but it didn't come through. So there's some tragic involved in all of this as well. Okay, our second point was then if he is a reformer. And there we compared him with John the 23rd, and we saw what a great man he was. He came from Venice, we mentioned, and then he already, the name is program. He gave himself the name of John the 23rd. We said there was already a John the 23rd, and he had resisted the council. He came to Constance. The council said, he thought he would remain. There were 3 popes. The council threw out 2 of them, and he thought he would remain the pope. And then he found out in the evening when he was at supper that they wanted to depose him too next day, and so he fled from the council. He ran away from the council into the Black Forest. The council met next day, and they sent the police after him, and then he was brought in, and he was sentenced to hard labor for 5 years in Venice. And so this whole historical thing that's why we bring that history in, not because we are interested in history, but because in order to understand what is going on now and tomorrow, we do have to bring in where it came from in order to understand it well. So that was one thing. Also, he was not a man who was interested now in dogmatics and in morality or whatever, but he saw the pain of the people, and the pain had something to do with the capitalistic development, with civil society pushing the family back, civil society taking the productive side of the family away and keep the caring side to the family, so that then the family didn't know how to care any longer, because without the productive side, you need the society then and the states to pay family wages, not minimum wages, family wages. And $15 is not family wage neither. So this whole problem comes from that the family was pushed back, civil society moved in the foreground, and so with this economic basis taken away, family is marriage, familial property, and education of children, and if that middle part is missing there, then of course you cannot have more children, or you cannot have any children at all. And so the Pope saw that pain of millions and millions of Catholics, particularly the working class, and so he wanted to do something, and he introduced that committee to discuss the question. And the committee, there was a doctor here from Kalamazoo was on the committee. The committee then decided that 2 to 1 that Catholics, men and women, could, in council with their father confessor and with their own conscience most of all, and with their friends and the doctors and so on, so that they then could decide to go on the pill and so on. So that was a progressive type of a thing, really. But then it was not followed up. So the Pope died, and the next Pope came in, Paul VI, and he saw then the effects of the wind going through the windows. So this all newness which came in, and he was frightened, and he didn't even let his seminarians go out at night anymore. He took the keys away from them. It even went into little details, this neurotic development. So we have that too. When the church becomes neurotic, then it irritates all things. We have that, for instance, with Galileo and Copernicus, and where Copernicus told the Pope that the Earth was not standing still, that it was going around the sun. The Pope had no problems. 70 years later, with Galileo, the Reformation came in the meantime, and then the Pope said we have to forbid it, and they showed the torture instruments to Galileo. The old man was 70 years old already. So that we see that when something earth-shaking happens in the church, it narrows itself down almost like an organism which concentrates itself when the disease attacks and so on. So, and this is also the reason for the restoration then. That is the reason for the whole hostility through the 19th century of the church against modernity. The church was frightened. The church had to rescue itself. And so Vatican I was the attempt to concentrate all power in the Pope, the infallibility dogma, because there were so many heresies, naturalism and Marxism and all this, and they had to pull it all self together. So we have to understand in this religious secular tensions that why the church sometimes acts so neurotically. To understand doesn't mean to excuse it, and doesn't mean to settle it neither, but it is a first step to do that. So nevertheless, this reformer now, you have to see the unbelievable catastrophe which the church was in when John the 23rd came. The war was over, the Second World War. It was won by the liberal powers and by socialists. So that means Hitler's backbone was broken in Stalingrad and in Kursk by the socialists. They really killed him, and not so much the bombing in the background or whatever. So, but this victory could, of course, not last. So Hitler waited to the moment that that Berlin would be, the besieging would stop, because there was a president. The Frederick the Great had been occupied or conquered almost in Berlin, and then in the last moment the Tsarina died, and the Tsarina was part of the alliance, and the alliance broke down, and Frederick the Great was free. So the fascists thought in the last moment that they could still be freed from this pressure from the East and the West. And when Roosevelt died, all newspapers in Germany said the Tsarina is dead. So that means Roosevelt was the Tsarina, and now the alliance would fall apart. But the alliance fell only apart after he was dead. So nevertheless, the fascism was conquered. But the church's history now, Pacelli, Pius XII, under whom I grew up in Germany, he worked out the concordats. There was first Mussolini, so the church fascist thing, and that has something to do with the very moment in which we are now, because Chomsky just said that Hitler came up under the same social conditions which we have right now. So that is against the Trump phenomenon. So this that the church had this background, and again, we have to understand this, and I try to make it clear a little bit, that there was a Spanish diplomat in the beginning of the 19th century, when the kings were removed by the third estate, by the bourgeoisie, that's the middle class. This is a middle class country here. We never had the nobleman. Lord Baltimore came for 3 years, and then he ran away as fast as possible. This was a purely bourgeois country, and still is. The fourth estate, the 250 million workers, don't know where to go. Some go with Bernie and some go with Trump, and they have no party of their own. So that's how bourgeois we are, that we don't have a labor party. The only country which doesn't have a labor party. So nevertheless, he predicted that when the kings, the first, the second estate, and the clergy would go, then dictators would come up, and there would be dictators coming out of hell. These are the socialist dictators. And then there would be dictators who come out from heaven, and these are the bourgeois dictators. And Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco, and Salazar, and so on, they were all bourgeois dictators. So the Church had 100 years' time to think about it, made the Lateran Treaty with the Vatican under Mussolini. Mussolini established that state. Trump said that the Vatican also has a wall. We are in the wall decade now. So it's true, the Chinese built a wall, the socialists built the Berlin Wall, the Israelites have a wall, now Trump wants to build a wall too. And it gets higher and higher from every meeting to the next. He even wants to build a wall in the Canadian thing, but he knows that it's 4 times the size of the Mexican one, so he doesn't know exactly how he should do it, but he will think about it, and he will come up sooner or later and have a new wall. So,
then you're Trump, tear down this one.
yeah, right. So, nevertheless, this so the Lateran Treaty established the church state again, and then behind that there's Garibaldi, and Garibaldi was that big nationalist who established the state of Italy. And behind that there's Alexander VI with Borgia, the Borgia Pope, who wanted to do the same thing already. See, you have to see the whole historical thing. So the movie which you see about the Borgias and Alexander VI and so on, that he tried to unite Italy already under the papacy, but that didn't work. But then Garibaldi was able to do it, and he wiped out the church state. So from Garibaldi, from 1870 to Mussolini, then there was no church state. And then Mussolini made peace, and they built the wall and all this. So then the state and the bank, the Vatican Bank, was established by German fascists. So there is this horrible, horrible thing between fascism and the church. It is still, one doesn't know psychologically. We know that Catholicism produces authoritarian personalities, and that's why we have so many people in the FBI and the army and so on. So, but and fascism, of course, is built on the authoritarian personality, and we describe the authoritarian personality. It means backward, the good old times in the past, and then it is pro-nationalistic, it is pro-capitalistic, it is sadistic, it is masochistic. And sometimes it's racist, not always, but that constitutes the authoritarian personality. And we have that in the church to a large extent, and we have it also in this fascist movement, and that may have something to do with it. Then it concorded with Hitler, and that means Hitler became acceptable diplomatically through that concorded in 1933-34. And it was all done by Pacelli, who then he was Secretary of State first, and then how Jesus got a Secretary of State, nobody knows exactly. So nevertheless, he was Secretary of State, and he made this thing. And I grew up under that concorded, and I told you about the Catholic Youth Movement and so on. So that John the 23rd was pained by this, and he therefore opened up, and under him the liberation theologians came up. Metz, whom I also brought here, Johannes Baptist Metz, he developed the new political theology from Constantine on through Augustine to Thomas of Aquinas. All political theology was on the right. The political theologians were on the side of the slaveholders, like Augustine. They were on the side of the feudal lords, like Thomas of Aquinas and Albertus Magnus. And then even in the 60s, the Jesuits would say, in Spain, our God is not a God of the workers, but a God of the owners. There is this right-wing thing, and we have this whole tradition. And then suddenly came a shift under John the 23rd, where a political theology was developed on the side of the working class people, on the fourth estate of the fourth estate. And so Johann Baptist Metz then became the father of this new political theology, and he became also the the grandfather of the liberation theology, and Romero and his priests and so on. So that is theology not on the right, but it's theology on the left. That's why Romero had to die. He was supposed to be on the side of the fascist general, but instead of that, he was on the side of the liberation theology, the martyrs, the priests who had martyred and killed and so on, with our payment, with our, our blessing and so on. That's another thing. We keep ourselves out of the thing for a moment. So this is the when Johannes Baptist Metz was a young priest, and he had a parish in Bavaria, and one day somebody appeared in his parish, and that was Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt was the political theologian of Hitler, Hitler had a political theologian. And he was also Hitler's jurist. So he did all the law things for Hitler and so on. Now he was now an older man already, and he said he came to the church, a Catholic, they're all Catholic. So he came to church and he talked with Johann Baptist Metz, and he said, I have a Prometheus, you have a Prometheus type of a theology, and I have one which is going backward into the past. So there is a theology which looks toward the past, and there is a theology which looks forward. Prometheus, one of the Greek gods, was a symbol for this progressive type of theology. So, and that all happened under John the 23rd. It broke up, and in the hope that then the council came, and it was a very optimistic time, and people were full of hope, and that makes us, and it was a reform movement. It was a reform movement. And so what we say here is we hope that the present Pope will continue this reform spirit of the council and before the council, and that we will not belong to these three predecessors and will become a restoration Pope. That was our theme. And so today now we want to have the third question now, is he a revolutionary? The word revolutionary, the prefix RE in Latin means backwards, so therefore it's a little bit irritating. So the question is, if one should not rather speak about provolution, that means moving forward. The same thing is with religion. Religion also is RE. It means to bind back to the origin and so on, to the mythical origin, and one could also call it better pro-religion instead of religion and so on. But these are linguistic things, and we want to use the words now as they usually used. So the question now is, of course, what is a revolutionary and so on. So if you ask, Benedict XVI, was Jesus a revolutionary, he would be horrified and would say no and so on. So when we ask the rabbi, are there revolutionaries in Judaism, the rabbi would say, in an immoral society, everybody who follows the Ten Commandments is a revolutionary. And there is some truth to that. See, so when Jesus says, I have not wanted to bring peace, but a war between father and son and so on, there can be very furious struggles in the family when some father or mother or so hold on to certain moral principles or whatever, and there is war going on, and so it is, unfortunately, it is true. So one could speak, about the spiritual revolution, and even Benedict would say, well, that may be true. So, but definitely Moses was a revolutionary. He built a whole state and so on. And of course, it was very violent. So recently, the students asked me if Judaism is a peace religion. Well, the biblical Judaism was not a peace religion. If you see what Joshua did when he ran over the Jordan and back again, what he did with Jericho and Ai and whatever, it's horrible. Not only did he burn all the places down, he butchered every man and woman in the town and so on, and took the cows for himself. So it's a horrible, horrible story. So, but then when the Jews lost the state, they became very peaceful. For 2,000 years, the Jewish people were very peaceful people. Well, let's hope so. So there are some exceptions. But nevertheless, as soon as the state of Israel was built again, then we suddenly have 5 or 6 wars again. So it may have something to do with statehood and what the state has to do to defend itself and its territory and so on and so on. So, but Moses was nevertheless, he was definitely a revolutionary. In the spiritual and also in the political and even in the military sense, the same thing is true for Mohammed in a certain sense. So in the second paradigm, there were, Dustin knows all about this, there were of course a lot of wars and conquering along the North African coast into Spain and into the Vatican and so on. So, but revolution now in the modern sense, again, that word is also historically, and there was Spartacus. Spartacus, you have heard this in the movie maybe and so on. So Spartacus was a real revolutionary. It was around the time of Jesus. And he organized the slaves in a real, taught them how to how to fight and use weapons and so on. He marched through all of Italy and then needed the fleet, and he made a deal with the fleet, and the fleet betrayed him, so he was caught, and 10,000 slaves were crucified at the Via Appia. The Via Appia, we will be in Rome there in a few months there. The Via Appia leads from Rome to the coast, and all along the road they were crucified, like Jesus was crucified. So the question is if Spartacus himself was crucified, and Catholic theologians will always say, no, he was not, because then he would become too similar to Jesus, and they don't like that. So they would say he fell in battle. There you see how history writing, it's first of all the winners who usually write history, but also if you write history or you philosophize, if you are an Aristotle or Plato and you are part of the slaveholders, you will talk like a slaveholder. If you are Thomas of Aquinas, even a saint in feudal times, you will talk like a feudal lord. And if you are bourgeois like Hegel or whatever, you will talk like the bourgeoisie does. So one can hardly escape one's class consciousness, and one has to be. That doesn't mean that they cannot say the truth. They can say the truth if you see the distortions and where they come from. So that if somebody says, like Aristotle, the slave is a slave by nature, he's just inferior biologically, and so you know that he is not a slave himself, but that he comes from the slave owners, and so it goes all over the place. So, okay, so, but what? So the revolution then failed, So you could say that Jesus did want to do the same thing like Spartacus, but in a different way. At least he told his people to buy thoughts at one point, but then when Peter took the thought and stabbed or tried to cut the ear off of some guy, then he said, put it back, put the thought back again, it's enough, or whatever. So maybe it was supposed to become, the march to Jerusalem was supposed to become a revolution also in the external sense, and then it failed, and that when the Last Supper took place, Jesus knew already that the revolution had failed when Judas left. So, but why he then wants to be remembered as part of a failed revolution is not entirely clear. So Jesus is full of mysteries and secrets, and one can study one's whole life long, and one still sees all these riddles. So, but for us now, in modern times, what does for us here in Michigan and so on, what does revolution mean? Of course, we had a revolution in England. The Calvinists, about this, they hanged the king, so, and the Catholic clergy too. So, and then we had in France, they guillotined the king and the Dauphin, the child too, and the wife from Austria. They were all, Dr. Guillotine was a specialist for cutting people to pieces very practically and technically and so on. So, and there were thousands of people, it was terror. So there is not only the religious terror of religious people, ISIS or whatever, there is also bourgeois terror. So suddenly in the French Revolution, in order to stabilize the revolution and so on, terror was used, and the guillotine was part of that. Part of the Parliament, the National Assembly, tried to rescue the king. They wanted to have a constitutional king in France, like they had in England, but the lower bourgeoisie, that is the basis of fascism, the lower bourgeoisie, the shopkeepers and so on, they wanted to have him guillotined, and they won then. So the upper bourgeoisie were bankers and industrialists. They wanted to have, like in England, but the others, they got through. That the Germans never had this revolution and this low-class rebellion, that produced Hitler. So if you want to understand why Hitler came up, he was the leader of the low bourgeoisie. And when you see a fascist at the horizon, and you would see that his following comes from there, because the low bourgeoisie is threatened from below by the labor unions and from above by the big chains. Think about the main street in Kalamazoo with all the little stores there, which last for 3 years, and then they go out of business again in spite of tax deductions and so on. That is very threatened. It's a medieval leftover, and it is threatened in a modern civil society. No matter what you do, or no matter how, both parties want to rescue the middle class, and then it goes down anyway. So, nevertheless, this is that was a revolution. So, a revolution means that the dominant class is overthrown. So, what happened in France? the clergy, which was the first class, first estate, and the others, they were overthrown. That is a revolution. So not a revolutionary vacuum cleaner or a revolutionary refrigerator or something like that. Somehow the name revolution historically has come down with us, and there are good reasons. So we hate all revolutionaries. We don't even want to use the word, except Bernie, of course. Bernie does a political revolution, yes.
Does it seem like we may be having a bloodless revolution right now in our political system?
Yeah, that is, we have to come to that in a moment. Yes, you are right. But we're going to have the phenomenon clear, right? So because we use that word in so many connections, and you know it's not entirely clear anymore what it should mean. So, but we had one here, see, but we call a revolution one which wasn't one in our textbook, and another one which was one we don't call a revolution. So Washington did not make a revolution. Washington called that what he did a revolution only in 1800, which was 20 years afterwards, and so on. And even then it wasn't a revolution. It could not be a revolution, because George was already a constitutional monarch, and you cannot make a revolution against the constitutional monarch because he has no power anymore. He's nothing. He is paid by the bourgeoisie, $1 million a year. Yes, I think in England now the Queen costs. So therefore, he could not make a revolution, even if he wanted to. So what was it? It was an emancipation struggle inside of the Western bourgeoisie. That means the Boston bourgeoisie wanted to sit in the parliament in London and make laws. And if they were not allowed to, they were not to pay tax anymore. The Tea Party now, but the tea tax was minimal. It was financially no problem whatsoever. It was purely symbolical. If we cannot sit in the parliament and discuss and make laws, we will not pay any taxes anymore. That means in antiquity, where we go to Dubrovnik, that was an Athenian colony. Then the people in the homeland had the same, or otherwise, the colonial people had the same rights as the people in the homeland. So, but not in modernity. So the people who were in Saudi Arabia, the British bourgeoisie in London and the bourgeoisie in Saudi Arabia, they did not have the same rights. And so that is why our war started here. And the British tried to keep the colonies and then the battle. But it was not a revolution. It was a war of secession or a war of emancipation, where the colonial bourgeoisie freed itself from the taxation of the homeland bourgeoisie. So, but the Civil War was a real revolution. It was the last bourgeois revolution before the socialistic revolution started. Well, the socialistic revolution started already in Paris in 1831, then in 1870, and then in 1848, and then in Hamburg and Munich in 1917, and in Leningrad, it wasn't Leningrad yet, and Moscow. And so these are the socialistic revolutions. The socialistic revolutions came because the bourgeois revolutions excluded them. So that means the bourgeois revolutions, they made constitutions like our own, and they sounded universal, freedom, equality, and so on. But they didn't say that it was just the third estate, that they had left something out, the fourth estate. That is why we don't have a Labour Party. So, and when they noticed this, when they noticed that the Constitution and the whole state apparatus was against them, they began to rebel. So then you had the bourgeois revolutions followed by all these socialist revolutions, which continue still in Venezuela and in Cuba and in China and so on, and they will continue. So nevertheless, the revolution, the Civil War, which we should then call a revolution, the ruling class of the North, the bourgeoisie, the Yankees, annihilated the ruling class of the South. The war purpose was to rescue the Union, not to free the slaves. You could not have two ruling classes in the same union. One had to go. You have to listen to the discussions in Congress. There, I read it recently, we read it again. There was a Southern representative who said, "You give us the N." I don't dare to say the word. "You give us the N and we give you the Quakers." So that was the deal which they wanted to make. And these discussions went on and on, but it could not be healed. So therefore, the one class annihilated the other because they had the better industry, and they had the better machine guns, they even had a U-boat, and so on. So they were simply better, but it was still an unbelievably furious thing. And you went to Gettysburg, I'm quite sure, and you saw the decisive battle and the horror between this. So the discussion of the main Union general and the president, they were interrupted. The telegraph interconnection broke down during the Battle of Gettysburg, so they had no connection. But then the president gave the general the order to pursue the southern general. He was fleeing to the south, and before he got to the main river there, to annihilate him. The language of Lincoln is just horrifying. So how beastly that was, the whole thing. So, and the general said, he sent him another telegram, and he said his troops were exhausted, and he could not pursue, and what Lincoln was frightened of really happened, namely the Confederacy went to the other side of the river and collected their energies again, and the battles went on after Gettysburg and so on. There is in Gettysburg something on the Confederacy side which I always have admired. The Confederacy did not have real reconnaissance. They didn't know exactly what was going on the other side. And so they marched in Gettysburg. You can drive with a car there and can look at all of this. They marched up a hill, and they couldn't see what was on the other side of the hill. But when they came up on the top of the hill, there were hundreds of Northern cannon standing there, and they started to fire. And you know what? The right wing of the Confederacy marched off the battlefield. They said, this doesn't make any sense. These are good soldiers. They are really beautiful soldiers who say, you know, there are reasonable battles and there are irrational battles, and they just march off. So, nevertheless, that's on the side. But there were also 75 army chaplains on both sides who told both sides, that's where Christianity comes in, both sides, that the more they killed of the other side, the sooner they would be in heaven. My granddaughter wrote a dissertation about them, so that is just also on the side. So, nevertheless, that was a revolution. So the Union was rescued, and then, of course, the slaveholder class was annihilated, and if you don't have a slaveholder class, you have no slaves anymore, and therefore the Emancipation Declaration, but they remain slaves, as you know very well. They built Washington still, the slaves, and they came then here to Michigan on the Underground Railroad, and then Henry Ford, the fascist, used them in order to break the strikes of the whites in Detroit and so on. So that slowly the slaves were then transformed into wage laborers. So, but the experience of this revolution explains to us why we don't really want to talk about this. So that when we ask the question already, you know, is the Pope a revolutionary? We don't have a good feeling, and I think they had some difficult time to announce it, even upstairs during the Mass. It didn't come out of the mouth of Sister Pam really well. So it sounds bad, because it was a horrible experience. We were only 40 million people at that time, and we thought there were 550 or so 1,000 casualties, but they were close to 1 million. But why we didn't count right was we didn't count those of the Confederacy, which was half of the casualties. So if you count them, then you have close to 1 million. And the butchery and the low level of medicine and the torture, you know, being hit by these, still from our terms, I was a battleman, so primitive conditions was just a horrible shock. And we have never forgotten this. And so if we are slowly, and if our working class is slow in listening to a message like even political revolution or so, not to speak of socialism and so on, then it gets a resonance in us which has to be understood, and it is very wise, because one could think of a revolution which would be non-violent, but historically they have always been violent. If one is well educated, it would be possible that one could avoid violence, but one does, even now we do not know exactly how that should go, but we certainly hope so. So that is nevertheless a revolution. So the ruling class which won in the Civil War is our ruling class up to today. They won the First World War, they won the Second World War, which increased their prestige tremendously and the trust in the people and so on in them and so on. They lost the Vietnam War, they lost the Afghan War, they lost the Iraq War. That brings this situation now which we have, and one of our great scholars, Chomsky, brought something about Donald Trump. He was asked, he is a linguist and he is a social scientist, he's a Jewish person, he's in his 80s now, and he is full of wisdom, and we operate together also in St. Petersburg and so on. And so he would say that fear, along with the breakdown of society during the neoliberal period, people feel isolated, helpless, victim of powerful forces that they do not understand and cannot influence. And he explains Hitler's power coming up with similar situations in Germany at this time, and I think there is some truth in this. So that we know exactly what revolution would mean, and then we can say, is the Pope now a revolutionary? Does he want to overthrow the American ruling class? That would not fit really the whole thing. That's not what he wants to do, and certainly not in a violent way or so. How that came about, he was asked, Pope Francis declared that he was not a communist, but that he was just following the gospel. Is the gospel revolutionary? What is a revolution? And so on. And so we talked about this now, and with this background, we can maybe make a decision where he may stand. So, but before I do this, let's look at what we did the last time. We talked, I think, about the reformer part. We did this now, and then we talked about the Pope being in Cuba and the Pope being in Mexico, and then making this statement on his way home from Mexico about wars. He did not mention Trump by name, and he said that later on when in Rome his people said that he didn't say Trump, and so on. But it was clear for the national and international press that's what he meant. He meant the wall builder, and but it was some diplomacy to play down the thing, and that's fine. So then we had also the discussion of Scalia, and when we want to say that the Pope has a teaching and a message, then the question is who will realize this message. So the Catholics, of course, 1/4 of the population are Catholics. So we called the Pope's teaching the natural law position, or we called it also Catholic solidarism. We said that Catholic solidarism is something between socialism and liberalism, right in between. We said that unfortunately, as we saw before, it opened itself up to fascism for decades and decades, but it could also open itself up to socialism. That's possible too. So Bernie loves the Pope. He loves everything what the Pope says, and the Pope didn't say anything yet, but he also likes to some extent what Bernie has to say. So, but there is an important thing in the message of the Pope, and that is property. His theory, which he has, holds on to private property, which means also the private property of the means of production. That means the tools by which you get oil out of the ground. Whoever has these owns them. He can employ other people, and therefore then can take the profits in order to buy the political system and prevent, for instance, that you have a Labour Party and so on. So that is the core thing. We said already private property is 10,000 years old. When we went from hunters and fruit pickers and so on over to agriculture in the Euphrates and Tigris, where Iraq is, and then in Greece and everywhere else. And so then we had villages and we had fields which are private property and cows, and then the city-states and civil society and the civil states. And we didn't make shoes in the family anymore. We made shoes outside, and we had shoe factories. We didn't make bread anymore at home. We had bread factories. And so you have the civil society in between the state and so on. And this civil society was based on poverty and destroyed all the city-states. And so that is the background of the whole thing. And then we had this protest early on, Francis will visit Assisi, where St. Francis went to the marketplace, took his clothes off, and was standing nakedly, and the bishop had to run and put his pluviale, the raincoat of the old senators, around him, so that he had something, that he was a little bit covered and so on, and threw the whole clothing into the face of his father, who was one of the early capitalists, one of the early owners. And then, of course, under feudalism that would grow, and it was finally by 18th century strong enough to break through and gain power. So it takes a long time until the class comes to the point where they throw off the power of the ruling class. So one has to be very patient. History takes its time. So that was the background there. So, but where I go back to is now, if the Pope teaches this reform type of a thing, but not a revolutionary theory he has, because the property is still there. So he would not say we have to expropriate the American ruling class. That means we have to nationalize the banks, and we have to nationalize oil and electricity and chemicals and so on and so on. That would be a real revolution. That would be the end of the American ruling class, no matter if it would happen with violently or non-violently, simply by making laws. But then you have to enforce the laws, and you need the military, and you need the police, and so on. So that is where the violent, and then they don't want this all to be taken away. If you have 10 billion, you don't want anybody to take it away, so they will resist it, and you have the counter-revolution. With the revolution comes the counter-revolution, and with the counter-revolution, usually also in Paris, then comes the violence, and comes the terror, and so on. So that is the issue. So therefore, one must never speak lightly about the word of revolution if one understands it, because it has been such a bloody thing. Very often the ruling class has been annihilated, like here in the South. In China, they sentenced all capitalists to hard labor, and as I said the last time, that's for capitalists to work is very hard, and so therefore they committed suicide. Instead, they were rather dead than to work. So this Trump is running around now for a whole year, didn't do a thing for but his workers continued, put the casinos up everywhere. So you don't have to work really. The trick of capitalism is that you need let the others work. So now so that, as far as the question is now, if we want to take that seriously, and Wall Street should really be afraid of the Pope, then the question is, who is to carry out that Catholic solidarism? Well, the Catholics, of course, but you will see that the Catholics took the side of Trump and not the side of the Pope during the last weeks or so. So when I came the second or third time to this country, I taught with the Jesuits, a Jesuit college in Baltimore. And so the first thing what I did here, I founded a union. But when I went to that Catholic college, the first thing I did, I wanted to teach the Catholic social encyclical letters. That means the Catholic solidarism thing. And the Jesuits, who had written those letters, because the popes don't write them, the Jesuits write them for them. So they told me I would lose all my friends in Baltimore if I would teach that. I said, you are strange people here. So, but nevertheless, I taught it, and I didn't lose all my friends. So it was a little bit too pessimistic. But the social encyclical letters and that theory of the Pope never got here fully, because when it got to the Irish, the Catholic Irish, they were poor people and cleaned the streets. They couldn't even read the encyclicals. But when the Irish climbed up to the higher level of the middle class, like the Kennedys, they didn't want to read them anymore. So you have a real miserable dilemma with this, what to do with his teaching. And I think I said the last time already, it's important, not if somebody's a woman or a man or black or white or whatever, but what theory does he have, right? So between Roosevelt, even mass murder of 2016. So we have a mass murder every 2 weeks, right? So you can now say already 2 weeks from now there will be another one. Right. Sometimes they come even, once a week or twice a week, and so on. So and it's only now this is something very sad and painful for me and for all of us. It doesn't happen in Denmark, where Bernie gets his socialism from. It doesn't happen in Germany, it doesn't happen in Russia, it doesn't happen in Canada. Why does it happen to us? What is it here which makes that happen? And to say this and to study this scientifically, and that would be very important. But we have to have this fact. What is the case? So it goes on here. So on Sunday, you know, all of it. Jason Dalton is the name, and he's 45 years old, and he shot 8 people, and he killed 6 of them, and the shooting occurred 3 different sites. He drove his taxi, and then he shot, and then he drove the taxi again, and shot again, and drove the taxi again. So it was obviously deliberate. He had no history of criminal history, no mental health history, nothing. He drove his taxi with certificates, and it was all okay. He used the gun which he bought legally, but which he couldn't use legally. I'm not entirely clear what the difference is. So, nevertheless, so that he was a husband and a father of 2. And then I may tell you things which were not so public knowledge, that he also was fired twice as an insurance man, so being fired, unemployed, terrible thing for a man. Also, his wife left. She wanted to divorce. She left with the children. She was hiding for some time. I don't know if she came out of hiding, if the police knew where she was, and so on. But nevertheless, there were family troubles there. So then there was, so you don't have to go into detail there. So the victims were a 53-year-old man and a 17-year-old son. So the arbitrariness, we call it a contingency problem. Our contingency problem is a theodicy problem. Theodicy is the root of theology. Theodicy means to justify the justice of God in the face of the injustices in His world, for which He is responsible. So that is a horrible thing when that happens, particularly for religious people. Corny Lowe was my dean, and his wife drove against the tree, and she was killed, and he was hurt very much, and he was in the hospital. All the ministers came, and he said, "This is absolute contingency." So sometimes we try to say, well, everything has a reason, but there are happening things which do not have any reason. My wife died 40 years ago, and up to today, I don't know any reason, and so whatever. And I have written about it, and other people have helped me to think about it, but there is no reason. So when that hits, that is a theodicy experience. And the religion goes up when it can give a good theodicy, why the gods or why God is doing that. And the religion falls and gets into a crisis when this is not answered anymore. And no world religion at this moment has a theoretical theodicy which on the present level of evolution and education would work. There is a practical one. No matter how senseless things are, you can still imitate Christ, and you can still suffer like He did, and so on. That's what we do in the hospitals. We say very often, a nun comes in, sister comes in and says, take your suffering, you dying person, like Christ in addition to. It's theological unsound, because when you have an infinite Son of God sacrificing His life for an infinite guilt, then it should be taken care of and should not need any further additions. But somehow the theology is a little bit on a different level. So, but nevertheless, one can still do this. And in Europe, or in the West in general, we could die like Christ, or we could die like Socrates, who died very heroically. He did not shout, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But up to the end, very ironically, he would have discussions all day long, then he would take the poison. And when the poison was already working, we all died from below. He took the sheath back and said, "I forgot to sacrifice to Aesculap." Aesculap was the god of health. Somebody who is dying, sacrifice him to the god of health. So he was ironical to his last breath. That's one way. And there's a third way how we can die in the West now. That's like Hitler. So there is a fascist death. And the fascist death means with much noise, not withering away in the cancer ward or so, but dying with a million Russians shooting at you and bombers bombing you, and then shaking hands in the end, saying goodbye to everybody and shooting yourself and so on, and much noise. That's a fascist death. And the philosophers have, I was in Hungary, in Budapest, and there was a great philosopher who who praised this type of dying, and we had a Lufthansa guy a few months ago who took his airplane right down into the Alps with big noise and so on and so on. So they do it not only in theory but in praxis as well. Okay, so here that was one of the victims, and then we had also, by the way, the girlfriend of the 17-year-old one, she didn't have a phone, so she had to climb over the dead boyfriend to get his phone in order to call the police there and so on. So it goes very much into cruel details. And then we had the Cracker Barrel thing, and then we had 4 people from 60 to 78 and so on. So this is the horrible side of the victims. But let me just see the following thing. You have this roadmap which I gave you, and there is the first page here. So when one wants to analyze something like this, then there are different levels on which one can analyze it. So one can, of course, approach this man there, Jason Dalton, on a chemical level. That's what our psychiatrists do. They give you right influence our fears, anxieties, and so on with chemicals, and we are very chemical all through, and we have the chemicals even from the Big Bang event. We still have the chemicals in us. So that is a way to deal with it, and we don't want to throw out any of these ways how one can deal with it. So when we say, well, we need, another legislation against weapons and so on, of course that should be done too. And if one says it's a mental health thing, so that should be taken serious too. But we know that it doesn't work. It's also the issue, the Enlighteners have already always attacked religion, because religion may be opium religion. That means it makes you feel good, but it dulls your conscience at the same time, so that you can live side by side of a slum, urban or otherwise, and you feel nothing, or you don't think about it, and you don't do anything about it, you don't even protest against it with your friends and so on. And so it is particularly ceremonial religions which have a rich liturgy and so on, who think when you have this rich liturgy, then it's done. So St. Augustine, I wanted to visit St. Augustine with my class, and then this catastrophe happened, and they had a vigil, and then they had a vigil in the Baptist center and so on. And these vigils are wonderful. But the Enlighteners say that the churches are responsible that people do not grow morally. That by saying, Christ is your Savior, then they say fine, and then they go on bombing people, go on, and nothing happens. That is the issue. So that is why the socialists are sometimes atheists or so, and why the bourgeoisie also said the same thing originally, until they found out that religion can be used in a certain way. So we have to think about that. Particularly, I'm Roman Catholic, and I like the liturgy. I always liked it, and when I go to the Benedictines in Switzerland or whatever, it's beautiful. You think you are in heaven already and so on. But does it really improve us morally? So maybe we should not stop doing this, but we have to ask the other question, how can that be translated now into effective type of action? And in our specific thing, will the Pope help us in doing that? Particularly when he talks about forgiveness. Forgiveness is beautiful, but if you forgive too fast, or you say, Christ is your Savior, you don't have to do anything. He did everything for you, so then you don't do anything. And then it looks the same next day, and so on, and there will be the next attack. So that is as far as the religious side is concerned. But if we look at the family, right, we did that already. So obviously the family has something to do with it. So we can say, psychology has something to do with it, but also the family, it disintegrated. But why do so many families disintegrate? Where does that lack of solidarity come from? Solidarity between husband and wife, solidarity between boyfriend and girlfriend, and so on. Solidarity in general, that's what binds us together. What's wrong that Chomsky discovered that? So we do have autonomy. I'm independent, and I'm, energetic and I can do what I want to. Why do we have more people in prison than any other country? It may be that we have in this antagonism between personal autonomy, I can do what I want to, I'm my own law, and on the other side, duty and rights, that we talk about rights all the time, but duties which we have in the family toward our partner, toward making money for the family, toward education of the children. When we say the children have the right to be educated, if you don't have somebody who does his duty and educates them, they will not be educated, no matter how much rights they have. And so it is everywhere. So it may have gone to an extreme. That means that we have developed this individualism, this narcissism, this to look in the river and you see only your own face until you fall into it and are dead, as Mozart and other people did it. Don Juan on the other side, who has all these girlfriends, but he can never come back to himself. So that we can come, when we don't go out to others, we cannot come back to ourselves and we are not free. Alienation. A nation is only so free as it can conquer its alienations. If you have the alienation between the genders, between the classes, between the races, and so on, then this is not a free country. A free country is one where the persons can go out to the other, and the other offers you the possibility to come back in her or in him toward yourself. And this is when you are then one with yourself in solidarity with the others. This is happiness, and this is freedom. And we have one side, but we don't have the other side. So the Slavs have solidarity, but there's a lack of autonomy, and it drives me crazy whenever I go there. So on the other hand, we have this autonomy, but we do not, I don't say we don't have any solidarity, because spontaneously it does come through. So I was standing on a bridge in Washington once. It was icy cold, and an airplane crashed into Potomac River. You know, there were 3, 4, 5 people on the bridge who jumped into that icy water in order to rescue these people. That is, and then didn't come out themselves. That is solidarity. See, we do have it. We have it when our system breaks down. Then we have it. But when the system comes up again, everybody goes into his own house, and then solidarity is gone. So we have to do something about it. The Pope's teaching is subsidiarity and solidarity. That is what he emphasizes. And so he could maybe help us to balance it better. There's nothing wrong with being autonomous. That's a good accomplishment. We will never give that up and go back to the 7th century to the ISIS people or whatever. It's out of the question. We'll die for it. It's so important it is. But we have to get the other side, the solidarity thing going in our marriages, in our families, and so on and so on.
What was the first word you just said?
Autonomy.
The Pope teaches...
Subsidiarity.
Thank you.
Subsidiarity means that you are an individualist, but there comes a time where you cannot pull yourself out by your own hairs. Yeah. You do need the family, you do need the society, you do need the state, which the neoliberals want to cut out all the time. And you need maybe even, the American community of Latin and North Americans and so on, but like Orleans, New Orleans, when we had the catastrophe. So, of course, we should do for ourselves, and we should be industrious, and we should not be lazy, and we should not cheat, and so on. So we all should do our part. That's the truth of individualism and liberalism. But there is something which is missing, and I think that it has something to do with these people feeling isolated, and then things are crowding on them, and suddenly they take revenge on whoever is just around there, and so on. So, but at least it's a point to think. But when you think now about the social conditions here, and very concretely here in our town there, so Kalamazoo and the surrounding cities there, we have 300,000 people, a population of 300,000 people here in our city, and it has a poverty rate of 38.8% in 2011, and it has increased in the meantime. We also have a very high number of children dying in this town, almost one of the highest numbers in the country. Then that in comparison to Flint, where we have this catastrophe, it has a poverty rate of 41.2%, and we are above Detroit, which has a 37.6%, and so on. So these are very high numbers for a society. between 1995 and now, the Kalamazoo area saw about half of its manufacturers disappear, so we have to bring the economic factor. So it's better to have a multi-factor theory and then combine it with what the Pope has to teach. And multi-factor says we don't say simply it's just economics, it's just capitalism, but that we take, psychological and social and religious and so on factors into consideration and see how heavy those factors are. So, nevertheless, the manufacturing jobs disappear from more than 32,000 jobs so we had 32,000 jobs, and now we have what is left there. I sacrificed this year 18,000 jobs left, and so on. So, and why are these? It is not technological unemployment, but it is an unemployment which means that the owner, not that the owner doesn't have enough profit, or by the way, what we would call enough profit, but there are two types of profit. One is for your entrepreneurial qualities, and the other one is for nothing. So that means, what is enough, and so on. But the principle is rather that you have to have more and more and more all the time. And there's no limit. With biological things, you can eat so much, but then there is a limit. Even with sex, there is a limit, astonishingly enough. So, therefore, but there, with this money thing, there is no limit. So, therefore, they look always for cheaper and cheaper labor and cheaper resources. And where they get it doesn't matter. They go to communistic countries, get it from China or go to India or whatever. So I do that myself even. I have some of my books. They are printed in New Delhi. In New Delhi, they cost $30. But when they come here to the bookstore, they are miraculously suddenly $80. Where do the $50 come from? See, that is why we have the usury laws in Islam and in Christianity and so on. These old people never knew when somebody produced something and then it was carried to another place, why it was suddenly $10 more. They didn't know why interest, when you pay $80 and then you get $10 interest. Where did these $10 come from? I had a class of business guys once, and one said, you're always so critical about capitalism, but that's why we're here. We want to have $100,000. And I said, well, I'm happy that you get $100. I said, take $1 out of your pocket now. Where does it come from? Did you work for it? That's fine. You can have more of them. Now, did your father work for it? Well, it's a gift. That's nice. But if you and your father, nobody worked for it, and it has value, then somebody worked for it and didn't get it, and you got it and you didn't work for it. That is the fundamental problem. Now, I'm looking after this guy. He really held his promise. He cares for his mother. The mother with two little business got bankrupt, pauper or somewhere. So he takes care of his mother. So, and he has maybe close to $100,000. He's a statesman. So somehow that there's nothing wrong with having $100,000 or even $10 billion like Trump. The question is only, where does it come from? He hasn't worked now for a whole year, and he still gets richer and richer. So obviously somebody else is working and doesn't get it, and Trump gets it, and he doesn't work for it. That's why he is a criminal. Everybody who does that is a criminal, because the guy who works for it and doesn't get it sits somewhere in a miserable house and so on, and he on the other side has what he worked for, and he didn't work for it and so on. That is the whole problem. That's a moral problem. That is why this system cannot be maintained.
Isn't that what Jesus called dirty money?
Yeah, dirty money. But Jesus was not against money as such. It was already a very low commodity exchange type of society Jesus lived in. So they had money, and they had money changers, and he threw them out of the temple and so on. So not money as such was bad, but money for which somebody had not worked. That is the issue. And this will haunt us, right? So no matter how much we dull our conscience, it will always surface again. Those things in the conscience, they are hard to repress, and they will always pop up again. So that is what we have to look for. So, but now as far as this statistics there is concerned, the significant portion of these lost jobs were tied to the auto industry, which saw a brutal restructuring in the wake of the global financial crisis of 2008. So we know that, how many people lost their pension and lost their houses, the house went under water, and so on. And we were also quiet. Why are we also quiet? That brings us back to the Civil War there. We have it burned into our flesh there, what happened, how many had to die, and how terrible and so on. And we don't want to have something similar again. It's very understandable. It's unconscious to a large extent, but we are very hesitating, and you know who knows it? The ruling class knows it. They know in their country clubs, that this cannot be maintained. This tremendous discrepancy of income that the CEO has 200 times more than the guy who works at the assembly line or whatever. This is outrageous. They know in the country club it cannot be maintained that way. So, but what can they do about it? They don't want to cut themselves and so on and so on. Yes?
But so isn't that where the bourgeoisie here are having a bloodless revolution and trying to throw the bums out of Washington and are so against the insider?
But the bums,
Now we're voting for another bum.
Yeah, right. But you see, Mrs. Clinton, we think they are so powerful, and this is the most powerful job in this world or whatever, but it isn't. Because of the fact that they are paid. If you don't obey the ruling class as a president or whatever, you are a goner. Kennedy, remember Kennedy, and his brother, and Martin Luther King, and so on and so on. Or even Nixon. If you don't do what they want to do, you are finished. It's not only that they stop paying you, they may stop you in the process. So, ruling class, we have repressed that. We think we're a free country and so on. There is one thing, you're a free country when you conquer your alienation between the groups, as I mentioned, But another thing is a free country that only a few are really free. And even the few who are really free, it's a precarious type of a freedom because they know very well in the country club that the others are the majority. They are only 1%, the others are 99% who own only 60% of what they produce. So therefore it cannot be maintained. The question is if we can educate ourselves and others that we can do it in a peaceful way, in a legal way. I mean, we have two capitalistic parties who every 4 years transfer power in a peaceful way. This is a great accomplishment. That's the accomplishment of bourgeois constitutions, Could not something similar, also happen in terms of ruling classes? See, because these politicians, they are the acrobats and the guys who make fun and smile and look good and so on and so on. Look, I don't want to be, I don't even want to mention it, but nevertheless, that is the problem. The real problem is this ruling class, these people who won the Civil War and who won the First World War and the Second World War. A very powerful class, should not be underestimated. And as long as they had this communistic Eastern Europe, there was always the danger, That's why they did the Marshall Plan, in order to stop the revolution in Europe. And they offered the Marshall Plan even to East Germany. They offered the Marshall Plan even to Moscow. And Moscow did not want to be bought, That is, when the wall was built in East Germany, the Russians did not build the wall. The East Germans built the wall. And the Russians resisted it 5 years. And the Russians said, you have to make your country better. Then you don't need a wall. And when you build a wall, it will look bad in the world, And they said, well, you people, you are easy to talk. You took all our railroads and everything as reparation, so you left us with less than nothing. You didn't give us a Marshall Plan, and now you say we should build up that country and so on. So after 6 or 7 years, finally Pankow, that in East Berlin, they built the wall, And of course, then when Reagan said, Mr. Gorbachev, take the wall down, Gorbachev didn't build the wall, and he couldn't take it down either. So that was the issue of the German Democratic Republic. And it was taken down. But that was the neoliberal counter-revolution. There had been 2 others before. We marched in with 12 other nations, 11 other nations, capitalistic nations, and wanted to kill Lenin. And it failed. There are still 8,000 Americans in Murmansk buried, Then came Hitler. They sent Hitler, and he almost made it, When they lost in Stalingrad, we almost made it, and so on. The European bourgeoisie. You have to think 4 million men marched with Hitler. They came out of all 28 states which make up the European Union at this moment. That was all of Europe which marched. There were Polish people marching against them and so on. So when I go to Yalta there, in the Crimea, which is now the new Republic of Crimea, there were Muslims who fought with Hitler. There was a Muslim division fighting for Hitler. And then when Stalin won, they were taken out of the Crimea and put in the Caucasus. And when Stalin died, they came back again. So I thought they would vote against the Russians, but they voted with them. That's why the Crimea became a free republic. So we don't know if you get a visa or whatever, but how it is now. So that is one case. So well, let's look at this here. Battle Creek there. It's in our neighborhood. Battle Creek, in the home of Kellogg's and other cereal makers, 47% of the population, or 15,000 households, lack the means to pay for housing, childcare, food, and other basic necessities, according to a 2014 study on the working poor in Michigan. You see also something when you say Kellogg. You see how the bourgeoisie keeps the 250 million workers quiet. They can keep a relatively high level of wages. So the Kellogg workers earn well, let's say, but Kellogg pays 70 cents in South Africa and in Central America. With this horrendous profit, he can keep the salaries higher here. That's how the liberals do it. The fascist for Hitler, the working class didn't pay any taxes at all. He got all the surplus money from the countries which he conquered and took that money and made the whole working class tax-free. Then the working class doesn't mind anymore if they have Krupp or Thyssen or Carnegie. Look at your elevators. They are still built by Siemens or something like that. These were the people who paid Hitler. So that is why, see, the question is how you keep social peace, that these people are not burning the cities down. You know, in the 40s, they burned Detroit down in the middle of the war, but Miami and Los Angeles and so on. So you stop them from burning down by keeping them on a certain level of comfort. So if you pay a Kellogg worker adequately that he can send his son to Western to get into middle management or whatever, and he has a little car and a little house, and his grandfather didn't have that, then he feels okay, and it doesn't matter how far Kellogg is away from his income or whatever. So that way, and therefore it is so dangerous when we say the middle class is disappearing. What they mean is the union created, so the sit-in strike in Flint created this, what they call middle class. That means well-paid auto workers. They could go up to 60,000 or whatever. That was more than it is now. And they could have vacations, and they had health insurance, and they could go to Miami and Disney Park and etc. So, but you know, when that doesn't, that Trump wants to bring the jobs back. It's not imaginable for any businessman how he can bring the jobs back. He would have to lower the income to a level where all the cities would burn. It is not possible. So, but you know that's.
What's going to happen? He's predicting that.
We'll see. We can get to that. But let me just end this here. West of Kalamazoo in Benton Harbor, that's a real depressed area, the official poverty rate in the town of 10,000 residents is 48.8%. That's almost half of the population. And the median household income is only 18,000. That's under the poverty line, compared to 48,000 for the state of Michigan as a whole. Appliance maker Whirlpool which still has its headquarters in the town, has shut down virtually all of its manufacturing facilities. So many of the boarded up storefronts and ruined neighborhoods in the city, which was under the control of a state-appointed emergency manager, see, that's already dictatorship. That means he neutralizes the mayor and everything. And it still hasn't worked, you know, from 2010 to 2013. Look the same as they did in 2003 when 2 days of riots erupted over poverty and police violence. So in Kalamazoo we have Grand Rapids on one side, we have Benton Harbor and so on. And the question is, you know, where will we go? And I hope we will go toward Grand Rapids, hopefully, right? So, and with the university and other things, it may very well work. So, but it is this, I don't tell you this in order to make you sad or whatever. The question is only if we take that serious, with the Pope, and the Pope coming here and knowing that he is not a neoliberal or whatever. He is that specific person with a specific message. It is worked out very well by very intelligent people since 1891, and it is a measured and middle way type of a thing. It is not revolutionary. So I think when we can say the Pope is not a man of restoration, the Pope is more a man of reform, and he is not a man of revolution. I don't think that Wall Street would have to be afraid of him as such. Yes?
We don't know, of course, how long the Pope is going to live, but you say like what he's done is like pastoral, like John the 23rd. But if he's going to do something significant, like accept these theologians, that you've met, when will you? I mean, how much groundwork is he laying, or when will he do it? Will he? You don't know. Nobody knows, but I'm just wondering if he's going to do it.
I mean, there are these internal things, inside of Catholicism. So inside of the church and reforms he can make, and we mentioned. So there is this concrete thing like, that divorced people who marry again cannot go to communion. I have a lot of these people around me, and they always go to communion, simply because they don't know, and I will not be the one who will tell them. But if you want to convince the Pope, then you have to make an argument, right? So that means you have to understand their argument, why they do that. They hold on to the gospel, first of all. That's ironical, because the Reformation was made because the church did not follow the gospel. But for once, they do follow the gospel. And so Jesus taught this, that whoever divorces a woman or man makes her into an adulteress. And whoever marries a divorced woman lives in adultery. And when you live in adultery, then you cannot go to communion. You would have to go to confession so that your adultery is changed, and you would have to stop the adultery too. But did Judas participate in the supper? Maybe he did. So there was no confession before the Last Supper or whatever. So there are issues of conscience where a person can ask for forgiveness. There is the issue that two people who are divorced and then live together take well care of each other, that they love each other, that their marriage is much more loving than the first one was. Then that should be enough of an argument to say that that they can go to communion. They are now married, and that is their past, and that is forgiven between them and God and so on, and they take good care of each other, and they love each other, and therefore they can go to communion. So, but it would have to be worked out, So what I do is simply not telling anybody, but if one wants to do it in public, in the church public, then the argument would have to be carried out. And the same thing now, he made some changes, so with an abortion, you don't have to go to the bishop, you can go to the priest and whatever. So that means the church, on one side, wants to hold on to the Gospels. On the other side, one cannot say, particularly with John the 23rd, that they are blind for the suffering of the people and so on. So they know that half of the church is divorced, and that divorce is not permitted by the Gospels. So what do? Annulment. They invent something, annulment. Now, one has to understand, that this is good intention, in spite of the fact that an annulment is not very easy. So you are 30 years married and you have 4 children, and suddenly it didn't take place. That is an acrobatics for human reason, which is a little bit too much, I would say. So this is what we try to do is to understand, the people of the Enlightenment who want to be rational and reasonable arguments, and on the other hand, people who say Moses said to Joshua, or Yahweh said to Moses, and Moses said to Joshua, and God said this, and it is written in stone, and so on, and Yahweh spoke through Jesus, and Jesus taught us this, and but still, celibacy is one thing. Should we not have a married and an unmarried priesthood is another reform thing, and there would be nothing against it, because Jesus did not demand it from anybody to live in celibacy. He was a rabbi, one of the early rabbis, and the rabbis were always married. The celibate would be against the first chapters of Genesis already. God created man and woman, and he made them one, and wanted them to have children, and so on. So, and then Paul says clearly, Jesus did not teach me anything about this. I make it up myself, and I feel good with that, and that married, fine, then he should do this, and so on. But I asked in Frankfurt, where I come from, the clergy of what they would do if, in case, there would be a married clergy, and they said they all would become married clergy. That shows you that celibacy is forced, and that cannot be maintained either. So these are internal reform things, right? So the church should, of course, follow its own natural law position, and the celibacy is also against their own natural law position. That's why they are so strange, when they deal with those things. Why they take child abusers back and put them back into service again, and so on. Because behind all that there is a bad conscience in a certain sense. So, and why not clear that up finally and learn from the Orthodox brothers and from the Protestant brothers, and make it both. So there may be some meaning in this, but Jesus did not mean when he said they were eunuchs by nature, eunuchs by society, and eunuchs for him did not mean the clergy. There was no clergy or whatever. He meant it for the divorced people. So therefore, if you marry again, it's adultery. So don't commit adultery, but stay unmarried for the kingdom's sake, where there is no marriage anymore, and so on. So. But the church applied it, and only in the year 1000, so together with the sacrament of marriage. So it came very late, and this all could be changed. So we can discuss, these inner church reforms, but then the Pope wants to talk to the world. He went to the UN, he went to the Congress, he talked to the world. So, and there he talked against poverty. The poverty, the poor, that is the working class, not only the working poor, all the others. So as soon as you put the word class in, it becomes, where does the Pope move? Where does the church move in terms of class? The ruling class, the American ruling class, represented, for instance, by Reagan for a little while, they have wonderful contacts with the cardinals in Los Angeles and with the cardinals in New York and so on. It was Reagan who never went to church because they thought they would kill him in the church. So, but he was the one who invited the Vatican nuncius into Washington and sent an ambassador to the Vatican and so on. So in a Protestant country, where they were in Philadelphia, the Catholics were by 1840, 50 or whatever, were persecuted, like as if they were communists or whatever.
Rudy?
Yeah.
We have just over 15 minutes.
Okay. So what do you want to do? Let me just, you can then read that last thing there, the revolution. So we decided that he's not a revolutionary, and he will never become one in his old age, but we hope that he will be a reformer. And so one way, to clarify this whole thing a little bit more would be to compare him with what happened with Romero, and with the 6 Jesuits who were killed, and the nuns, some of them were my students, who were killed, and 70,000 members of the basic Christian community were killed by the Arena Party, A horrible slaughter, which just, south of us, down there in our backyards. And so on. So capitalism is expensive, And why was Romero killed? These people, these liberation theologians, they are political theology on the left now, and they don't want to destroy the ruling class, by the way, there. They want them to pay decent living wages. So these Jesuits who were killed, the 5, who they were all economists. You know, a Jesuit has 6 years theology studies, and then he studies something else, medicine or economics and so on. So they were all economics guys, and they looked at these sacks of coffee beans, you know, which these people produce, and then see what they got for their children to feed them and so on, and then what the middleman was, and until it comes to you and you drink that coffee, and suddenly it costs so much, and they get so minimal of it and so on. So they were killed because they said that the workers had a right to organize. When the workers organize, then they will look at these economic things, and they want to have a bigger share of what they produce, because they are the only producers, the owners of these coffee plantations. They don't produce anything. It's the workers who produce it. So they want to have enough so that their children don't become sick because they're malnourished and their brains don't grow, and so on and so on. So that is all. But that is because if they get this increase of their minimum wage, it does lower the profit of the owners, and that is why they are killed. By fascists, the Arena Party. Fascism comes in when in a liberal society the injustices become horrendous. Then socialists suddenly come up and say, this is not just. Then the fascists come in and take care of the socialists, and then you have liberalism again. That is the whole issue. So if the socialists would win here, they would pay Trump more than he has already in order to move them out. At this moment, as we said, both parties are against Bernie. Both parties are against Trump. Both parties, or one party, will bring in the former mayor of New York if Trump doesn't go away. The other one will bring in the vice president if he doesn't go away, in order to restabilize the system. Because the stabilized system with 2 liberal and 2 capitalistic parties is what the ruling class needs. And neither the liberals nor the fascists are entirely cruel, so that they want people on the north side to live that way or so. Therefore, they always do something. You can, and that's why Clinton is good, both Clintons. They get concessions from the ruling class. And they say, we have to introduce that educational or this medical thing and so on. That's good for the people, and so on and so on. And when they can make the point, they will get something. You know, they can. So when she says, you know, I have been paid by them, but I have done good things at the same time, that's true. That means she is able, you know, to be paid and at the same time get some concessions from the ruling class, for instance, to go from $9 to $15 minimum wage or whatever. Now, if she would say, you know, I need a living wage, $20 or whatever, that would be out of the question. But depends then how skillful they are. When I was a prisoner in Norfolk, you know, the German prison camp, the prison camp was governed and ruled by a big Lithuanian who was stronger than we all were together. And the American police, secret police, and so on, they were outside. They governed the camp through that giant there. That is how the whole system works. The ruling class governs the country through the Congress, and so on and so on. And through payments, but through other means as well. See, Trump is not really a part of it yet. It's not only that you have billions to belong to the ruling class or the same country club or the same church. It means that you share the culture and that you have been in there for generations and so on. He's only in there for 2 generations. So therefore he may hang a little bit in limbo there with his whole acrobatics and so on. But, and then we have to be careful, you know, we have not used the word fascist as a bad word to shout, but as a technical word. There is a real philosophy of life, of fascism. And Hitler went only to the extreme, you know, with his whole living in celibacy and devoting his whole life for it and so on. And Mussolini was also, he invented it somehow, and it's called corporatism too. It is a marriage between the corporations and the government. And we are very close to this. And so if you have words like the wall is symbolical, for exclusiveness, and then there are nationalistic tendencies, there are racist tendencies in him. I don't think that he has a compact theory like you have it with Hitler in My Struggle. There are other books, where fascist theory is, and they have ancestors, they have great philosophers like Schopenhauer and so on. So it is not to be underestimated, So if you think of people who have cut their hairs and skinheads or whatever, that's a naive thing, It's a very powerful thing, and it is a blood and soil type of a thing, that your whole biology is involved. So I had visitors, 2 SS-men visit me in Baltimore, and my wife, American wife from Washington, and she was frightened of the 2 and didn't even know why she was frightened, It's atmospheric. And so they came in and they said they were SS-men, and I knew I was German, and I was in the Air Force and all this, and so they became very comradely and friendly and so on. So, and they complained that they were just working on the building trade, that wasn't good for them. They were called for higher things, and they wanted to get to them and so on. And then when they were gone, my wife told me how frightened she was, and without knowing, who they were. So there's something biological with them, and they underwander all rational discourse. That means it is a matter of feeling, a matter of instinct, and of blood and soil type of solidarity. You belong to that national group, there is something powerful in that, when this is actualized. As a matter of fact, it ruined the whole, what is called today, Eurasia. That means the whole Slavic world. Neither the CIA, nor the FBI, or their own, the Secret Service in Moscow, had an idea how strong that nationalism can be. And after 70 years, where the communists tried their best to mitigate it and subdue it, it suddenly broke out as if it had never been disturbed by anything, and so on. And so the Putin governs today, with several fascist parties on the right and with several communist parties on the other side, and he does some kind of a balancing act, which is amazing, He's not only the guy who rides around naked on a horse or whatever. So, these are all very funny things, I enjoy them, but it just has little to do with the reality, which somebody does. So he speaks fluently German, and he has a wonderful relationship to Merkel in Berlin, because he was stationed in Berlin as a policeman, as a Russian policeman, and so he they shook hands there in Munich, last week. So I am very happy for their cooperation, in Syria, and I hope it will go elsewhere, and we have not put the rockets back. That is the good thing of Obama, he's a measured man, he's not a wild man, and so on. So hopefully, they will cooperate, and they will compete with each other. Who can best balance personal autonomy and solidarity? They have to learn, we have to learn, and then it will be good for the species, because if we actualize our 77,000 atomic weapons, and they take Baltimore out and we take Kiev out, it will be the end of the species, or at least on a very low